Leo never imagined a simple morning walk would become a matter of life and death. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to bleed over the rooftops of Mill Creek, a town so quiet you could hear the dew settling on the grass. Every day, at this exact hour, the boy and his 2 dogs would appear, silhouettes against the rising sun. He was a small figure, no older than 10, swallowed by an olive-drab coat that had seen better decades. Flanking him were 2 massive, scruffy dogs, a mix of shepherd and something wilder, their coats the color of dust and charcoal. They moved with a purpose that felt ancient, a silent, disciplined unit navigating the sleeping streets. To the few early risers who saw them, they were a curious fixture, a painting that repeated itself each day. The dogs, Atlas and Bear, never barked. They never strained at the frayed rope leashes he held. They simply walked, their amber eyes constantly scanning, their powerful bodies a living wall around the small boy. This routine seemed harmless, a boy's simple devotion to his pets. But their fierce, unwavering vigilance hinted otherwise. When a car slowed too close, or a stranger made the mistake of trying to greet them, the dogs wouldn't bark. A low, guttural rumble would vibrate from their chests, a sound that was less a warning and more a promise. The boy would just whisper, "It's okay," his voice a soft rasp, and they would settle, but their eyes never left the perceived threat. The townspeople whispered their theories over coffee at the local diner. "Neglected," one would say, stirring her cup. "No boy that young should look so tired. And that coat, it's filthy," another would counter. "It's the dogs I worry about. They look half-starved and mean. He's training them for something, I tell you." They saw a lonely child and 2 dangerous animals. They saw a problem. What they couldn't see was the truth shivering beneath the oversized coat, the secret that weighed on his narrow shoulders more than the world itself. This was no ordinary walk, it was a desperate, daily mission. It was a hunt. And Leo was hiding a secret so shocking it would soon bring their quiet little town to its knees, forcing everyone to confront the difference between what they see and what is real. Stay with us, and you'll discover what one little boy was willing to risk for a family nobody knew he had. The first person to feel the pull of the mystery was Alara Gable, a widow whose house sat on the corner Leo passed every morning. Her husband had been the town doctor, a man who believed in looking past the symptoms to find the cause, and she had inherited his keen sense of observation. At first, she'd simply enjoyed the sight of them, a portrait of loyalty. But soon, the details began to snag at her attention like burrs on a wool sweater. The boy's hands, raw and chapped from the cold, even on mild autumn mornings. The way he walked, not with the carefree bounce of a child, but with the weary, determined shuffle of someone carrying an invisible burden. And the dogs. She saw not menace, but a profound, heart-wrenching devotion. They didn't just walk with him, they guarded his every breath. One morning, a delivery truck backfired, the sound cracking through the stillness like a gunshot. Leo flinched violently, dropping to one knee. Instantly, Atlas and Bear were on him, not attacking, but shielding. They pressed their bodies against his, their heads low, their growls a solid wall of sound directed at the empty street. Leo wrapped his arms around Atlas's thick neck, burying his face in the dog's fur, his small body trembling. Mrs. Gable watched from her window, her heart aching. That wasn't the behavior of a boy and his pets. It was the behavior of soldiers in a foxhole, of survivors clinging to each other in the dark. She started leaving a small bag on her porch for him, a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. For 3 days it sat untouched. On the 4th morning, she watched as Leo approached. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the bag. The dogs stood like statues, sniffing the air. He took a tentative step, then another, his eyes darting around as if expecting a trap. He snatched the bag and ran, disappearing down the street with the dogs loping effortlessly beside him. He didn't eat the sandwich. Mrs. Gable saw him, from a distance, tear it into pieces, giving every last crumb to Atlas and Bear, who devoured it gently from his trembling hands. He only watched, his own hunger a ghost in his hollow cheeks. The questions in her mind grew louder. Why was he so hungry? Why did he feed the dogs before himself? And where did they go? His walk never ended at any of the houses in the neighborhood. They always headed toward the old industrial park on the edge of town, a place of rust and ruin that everyone else avoided. The days grew shorter, the air turning sharp with the promise of a hard winter. A notice went up on the chain-link fence surrounding the abandoned cannery in the industrial park. Property sold. Demolition scheduled November 15th. Mrs. Gable saw the sign on her afternoon walk and felt a cold dread snake around her heart. She didn't know why, but she knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that this sign was a death sentence for someone. Leo's desperation escalated. His morning walks became frantic scavenging runs. Mrs. Gable saw him behind the diner, his small hands digging through the dumpster, pulling out day-old bread and discarded meat scraps. Bear stood guard at the alley entrance, a silent, menacing shadow, while Atlas stayed close to Leo, nudging the boy's hand with his nose as if offering encouragement. Leo would stuff the findings into the deep pockets of his coat, the fabric bulging with his stolen treasures. He grew thinner, the circles under his eyes darkening to purple bruises. He looked like a ghost haunting the edges of the town, visible only to those who truly cared to look. Mrs. Gable knew she couldn't just watch anymore. The demolition was only a week away. Whatever secret he was protecting, whatever life he was trying to sustain in that wasteland, was about to be crushed into rubble. One morning she decided to follow him. She bundled up in her warmest coat, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She stayed far behind, using trees and parked cars for cover. She watched him collect the bag she'd left, this time containing high-protein dog food and a thermos of hot soup. As before, he gave the food to the dogs, but he did stop to drink the soup, his small hands wrapped around the thermos for warmth. He drank it slowly, gratefully, and for a moment, he just looked like a little boy again. The moment passed, and the weary soldier returned. He led his two guardians past the last row of houses, toward the skeletal remains of the industrial park. The air grew colder here, the wind whistling through broken panes of glass and rattling corrugated steel. It was a graveyard of industry, forgotten and forlorn. The dogs became even more alert, their ears twitching, their noses to the wind. They guided Leo not along the cracked pavement, but through a path worn in the overgrown weeds, leading directly to the hulking, rust-streaked cannery. The building loomed over them, its windows like vacant eyes. A large section of the wall had crumbled away, creating a dark, gaping maw. Leo slipped through it without hesitation. Atlas and Bear paused at the entrance, turning their heads as one, their eyes seeming to stare directly at the spot where Mrs. Gable was hiding. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. They knew she was there. They had known all along. But they didn't growl. They simply held her gaze for a long moment, a silent plea in their intelligent eyes, before turning and following their boy into the darkness. Mrs. Gable's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to call the police, to find an adult to handle this. But the image of Leo's haunted eyes, and the memory of the dog's silent plea, held her rooted to the spot. She crept forward, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. The smell hit her first, a thick, cloying mixture of damp, decay, and something else, something animal. It was the smell of a kennel, but wilder, tinged with sickness and fear. She peered through the hole in the wall. The inside of the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, vast and cold. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked skylights, illuminating swirling dust motes and casting long, distorted shapes across the concrete floor. At first, she saw nothing. Then, her eyes adjusted, and her heart stopped. In the center of the cavernous space, nestled in a makeshift den of old blankets, discarded insulation, and cardboard, were more dogs. Not 2. Not 3. At least a dozen. They were the lost, the broken, the forgotten. A 3-legged pit bull with gentle eyes. A scabby terrier mix shivering uncontrollably. A litter of puppies, barely old enough to walk, huddled around their skeletal mother. And more shapes moving in the deeper shadows, their eyes gleaming like faint stars in the gloom. Leo was moving among them, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "It's okay, Daisy. I brought food. See? Plenty for everyone. He knelt beside the skeletal mother, crumbling the dried dog food into a pan, his touch infinitely gentle. The two alphas, Atlas and Bear, stood watch over the pack, their presence a calming force. They were the protectors, the providers, the loyal lieutenants to their small, human king. Mrs. Gable pressed the hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. This was his secret. This was his burden. He hadn't been training two dangerous dogs. He had been trying to save a whole family, a pack of suffering creatures that the world had thrown away. He was their only hope, their fierce, 10-year-old guardian angel. She understood everything in a blinding flash of insight. The oversized coat for smuggling food, the exhaustion, the constant fear in his eyes. He was a child trying to hold back an ocean of suffering with his bare hands. As she watched, a low rumble echoed from outside, a sound that shook the very foundations of the building. The dogs whimpered, pressing closer together. Leo froze, his head snapping up, his face a mask of pure terror. The sound grew louder, the guttural roar of heavy machinery. The demolition crew. They were early. Panic erupted in the cavernous space. The roar of a bulldozer's engine shattered the fragile peace, a mechanical dragon waking from its slumber. The dogs began to bark and whine, a chorus of fear echoing off the high steel ceilings. Leo scrambled to his feet, his small face pale with terror. "No," he whispered, the words stolen by the noise. "Not yet. It's not time yet." He ran toward the weaker dogs, trying to coax them toward the opening. "Come on. We have to go. Now." But they were paralyzed by fear, cowering in their makeshift den, their eyes wide with confusion and panic. The three-legged pit bull, Daisy, tried to stand, but her legs trembled too much, and she collapsed back onto the dirty blankets. The mother of the puppies frantically tried to gather her litter, nudging them with her nose, her low whines lost in the growing din. Leo was just one small boy against a tide of terror he couldn't control. He pulled at the collar of a scruffy mutt, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged. "You have to move." Outside, the bulldozer lurched forward, its massive steel blade lowering toward the ground. Mrs. Gable knew she had only seconds. The boy, his secret family, they were all about to be buried alive. Adrenaline, fierce and hot, surged through her. She burst from her hiding place and ran, not toward the warehouse, but directly into the path of the machine. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice surprisingly powerful. She threw her arms out wide, a frail, gray-haired woman standing against a 10-ton monster of steel and diesel. The operator, a burly man in a hard hat, stared down at her in disbelief and slammed on the brakes. The machine shuddered to a halt just feet from where she stood. "Lady, are you crazy?" he yelled over the idling engine. "Get out of the way!" "No!" she shouted back, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't do this! There are lives in there!" Just then, Leo appeared in the crumbled opening of the warehouse, his face stained with tears and dirt. He saw Mrs. Gable standing defiantly before the bulldozer, and his eyes widened in shock. Atlas and Bear were right behind him, and they did something they had never done before. They barked. Not the low growl of warning, but deep, booming barks of desperation, a frantic alarm that echoed across the industrial park. The commotion drew the attention of the rest of the work crew, who began to gather, their faces a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. The foreman stomped over, his face red with anger. "What in God's name is going on here?" "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move, or I'm calling the police." "Call them," she retorted, her chin held high. "Call the news, too. Tell them you're about to tear down a building with a child and a dozen helpless animals inside." The foreman's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from the defiant old woman to the terrified boy and his two formidable guardians. He scoffed. "Animals? This is a demolition site, not a petting zoo." He took a step forward, but Atlas moved to block him, planting his feet and letting out a growl so deep and menacing that the man froze in his tracks. At that moment, a small, whimpering puppy, emboldened by a moment of foolish courage, wobbled out of the darkness and collapsed onto the gravel just outside the opening. Its tiny body trembled, a fragile testament to the truth of Mrs. Gable's words. The foreman's angry expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of stunned silence. The entire crew went quiet. The standoff was broken by the squeal of tires. A car, followed by a news van, pulled up, alerted by one of the workers who had quietly made a call. A local reporter jumped out, a microphone in her hand, her cameraman already filming. The scene was surreal: a determined old woman, a terrified little boy, two powerful dogs standing guard, and a single, shivering puppy, all holding a massive bulldozer at bay. The foreman saw the camera and swore under his breath, realizing he was no longer in control of the situation. The secret was out. The arrival of the news crew was like a lit match in a powder keg. Everything happened at once. The foreman, seeing his company's name about to be dragged through the mud on the evening news, immediately ordered the machines shut down. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of the puppy and the frantic questions of the reporter. Mrs. Gable knelt by Leo, putting a calming arm around his shaking shoulders. "It's going to be okay now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You did so good. You kept them safe." Leo just stared, his mind struggling to process the whirlwind of events. His secret world, so carefully hidden in the shadows, had just exploded into the harsh light of day. He was terrified of what would happen next. Would they take his family away? Would they blame him? The town's animal control officer arrived, a grim-faced man named Peterson, known for his by-the-book approach. Leo shrank back, pulling Atlas and Bear closer. He expected the worst. But as Officer Peterson took in the scene, the makeshift den, the array of sick and injured dogs, the raw desperation on the boy's face, his stern expression softened. He saw not a nuisance, but a rescue. A desperate, misguided, but heroic rescue. He knelt, speaking softly not to Leo, but to the dogs. "Hey there, big fellas. You've done a good job." He pulled a blanket from his truck and gently wrapped up the shivering puppy. It was a gesture of such kindness that the tension in Leo's small body eased just a fraction. News of the standoff spread through Mill Creek like wildfire. People started arriving: the waitress from the diner, the mechanic from the corner garage, teachers from the local school. They came with blankets, food, and offers of help. They saw the dogs not as a menace, but as a family. They saw Leo not as a strange, neglected child, but as a hero. The developer who owned the property, facing a public relations disaster, made a hurried call, not only halting the demolition indefinitely but also making a sizable donation to the local no-kill shelter. A local veterinarian, Dr. Aris, showed up with his medical bag and began triage right there on the dusty floor of the warehouse, tending to the sickest animals first. He looked at the skeletal mother dog, whose name Leo whispered was Hope, and gave the boy a reassuring nod. "She's a fighter. They all are. Thanks to you." It was a slow, careful process. One by one, the dogs were coaxed out. The volunteers, guided by Leo's quiet instructions, he knew every dog, every fear, every gentle touch they responded to, loaded them into crates. Leo refused to leave their side. He rode in the animal control van, his hands pressed against the cages, whispering promises that he wouldn't abandon them. Mrs. Gable was right there, her hand resting on his shoulder, a silent, steady presence. When they arrived at the shelter, the staff was ready. A special quarantine wing had been cleared out just for them. They called it Leo's Pack. He walked down the line of kennels, making sure each dog was settled. When he reached the last one, holding Atlas and Bear, he finally broke. The weight of the months of fear, hunger, and responsibility came crashing down, and he sobbed, burying his face in their thick fur. They licked his tears, their strong bodies pressing against him, their duty done. They were safe. They were all safe. In the weeks that followed, the town of Mill Creek transformed. The story of the boy and his secret pack became a local legend, a tale of quiet courage that reminded everyone of the power of compassion. The shelter was flooded with donations and volunteers. Every single one of Leo's dogs, once they were medically cleared, found a loving home. The three-legged pit bull, Daisy, was adopted by a family with a child who used a prosthetic leg. They understood each other perfectly. Hope and her entire litter were taken in by a farmer with acres for them to run on. As for Atlas and Bear, no one could bear to separate them, or to separate them from the people who had brought them into the light. Mrs. Gable adopted them both. Her quiet house was suddenly filled with the comforting weight of their presence, their gentle snores filling the rooms where silence had once lived. Leo's life changed most of all. Child Protective Services investigated and found his home life to be one of profound neglect. His parents were present in body but absent in spirit, too lost in their own problems to notice their son was slowly starving. With their reluctant blessing, Leo went to live with the one person who had truly seen him, Mrs. Gable. Her house became a home, filled with the smell of baking bread, the warmth of a fire, and the unwavering loyalty of two very large dogs. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of town. He was a boy. He laughed. He went to school. He made friends. But his work wasn't done. Every day after school, he would go to the shelter, now a junior volunteer. He had a special touch, a quiet understanding of the most frightened and broken animals. He was their voice, their champion. He had found his purpose not in the shadows, but in the light. What began as a desperate, lonely walk to feed a secret family became a journey that saved not only a pack of dogs, but a boy, and in many ways, an entire town. It was a testament to the fact that you don't need to be big or powerful to make a difference. Sometimes, all you need is a coat with big pockets, an unbreakable will, and a heart full of love. Leo learned that true family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the one you fight for, the one you build from the broken pieces of the world. One sunny afternoon, months later, Leo walked through the park. He wasn't wearing the old, oversized coat anymore. He was just a boy in a bright red hoodie, throwing a ball for Atlas and Bear. Mrs. Gable sat on a nearby bench, smiling. He was no longer flanked by guards. He was surrounded by friends. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He had faced down bulldozers in despair, and he had won. He had shown everyone that loyalty isn't just a word, and that courage can be found in the smallest of hearts. And if you ever find yourself walking through a quiet town at dawn, and you see someone, anyone, who looks a little lost, maybe don't just walk by. Look closer. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones hiding in plain sight, carrying a secret that could change the world, if only someone is brave enough to see it. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking and sharing it, and subscribe for more stories that restore your faith in humanity.